The woman's shoes were the first thing Nora noticed. Not because they were beautiful, though they were. Cream-colored leather pumps with a red sole. The kind of heel that cost more than most people's monthly rent. What caught Nora's attention was the way the woman wore them. Not carefully, not the way someone wears shoes they saved up for. Casually. The way you wear something you've owned so long it has become invisible to you. Like skin. Nora was on her knees at the time, scrubbing the grout between the marble tiles in the east foyer of Elliot's mansion, because Maria had called in sick at 7 in the morning, and the flooring company had left a faint chemical residue the night before. And Nora was the kind of person who could not look at a problem and simply decide it was someone else's job. She had changed out of her dress and into an old pair of jeans and a gray cotton shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a knot, her hands inside yellow rubber gloves. She was not trying to make a good impression on anyone. There was no one to impress. Elliot was in a board meeting in Midtown until 4. The household staff had been reduced to skeleton crew after a scheduling mix-up, and the family dinner her future mother-in-law had requested for Sunday was still 48 hours away. She had time. She had a scrub brush. She had a playlist of early 2000s R&B coming through one wireless earbud, the other ear left open out of habit. That was how she heard the shoes. The click of a heel on marble is a specific sound, different from sneakers, different from loafers, different even from the block heels the housekeeping staff sometimes wore. This was a sharp, confident sound. The sound of someone who had walked on marble floors their entire life and had never once thought about the noise they made. Nora pulled the earbud out. She looked up. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 65, though she carried it the way certain women do. Not fighting the years, but having reached some private agreement with them. Silver hair cut cleanly at the jaw, a camel-colored cardigan over dark trousers, and those shoes. "You must be the new placement," the woman said. Her voice was measured, the vowels shaped by the kind of education that cost money. "I'm Margaret. The agency sent me." Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the shoes again. Then she looked at the woman's hands. The left one resting on the doorframe, fingers slightly curled. The nails were short and unpolished, which was either the mark of practicality or of someone who had thought carefully about practicality. And the skin at the knuckles was smooth in a way that did not come from years of cleaning products. "Great," Nora said. She peeled off one rubber glove and stood up, extending her hand. "I'm Nora." The woman shook it with a grip that was firm and brief. Not the grip of someone accustomed to deference, but of someone accustomed to meetings. "The foyer?" she asked, glancing at the tiles. "Almost done. The residue is mostly in the grout lines. If you want to start somewhere else, the kitchen could use a wipe down. The staff was short this week." "Of course," Margaret said, and turned toward the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had been given a tour they did not need. Nora watched her go. Then she put her earbud back in, lowered herself to her knees again, and pressed the scrub brush into the next grout line. She had worked in hospitality for 11 years. Front desk at 22, guest services coordinator at 24, assistant general manager of a boutique hotel in the meatpacking district at 27, and then for 4 years before she met Elliot, general manager of the Harrington Grand on the Upper East Side. 240 rooms, a Michelin-starred restaurant on the 4th floor, and the kind of guests who traveled with their own pillowcases and expected you to already know this. She had learned in those years to read a room. More specifically, she had learned to read a person the way a room reads itself, through details that don't announce themselves, that are simply there for whoever bothers to look. The woman in the kitchen was not a housekeeper. She moved through the space like someone cataloging it, opening a cabinet the way you open something you want to understand rather than something you need to use, running a finger along the edge of the counter with the deliberate quality of an inspection. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove and stood looking out the window above the sink, and the stillness of her was not the stillness of someone resting between tasks. It was the stillness of someone thinking. Nora finished the foyer and moved to the hallway. She gave Margaret her space. She did not stare, but she noticed things. She noticed that when Margaret picked up the feather duster from the supply closet, she held it for a moment too long before beginning. A fraction of a second's hesitation, like someone picking up an instrument they haven't played in decades. She noticed that when she dusted the bookshelves in the sitting room, she paused at certain photographs and then moved deliberately on, the way you look away from something too familiar. She noticed most of all that at 11:15, when Nora brought 2 mugs of coffee into the kitchen, one for herself, one offered, Margaret accepted it with both hands wrapped around the mug, in the gesture of someone who was cold or grateful or both. And the small noise she made when she sipped it was involuntary and genuine. "Thank you," Margaret said. "Of course," Nora said. She leaned against the counter, holding her own mug. "Have you worked with the agency long?" "Not long," Margaret said. She looked out the window again. The November light was gray and thin, the kind that made the bare trees in the back garden look like something out of a painting, slightly too composed to be entirely real. "You don't take sugar?" "Black," Nora said. "You?" "The same." A pause. "Most people offer it without asking." "I noticed you hadn't looked for it." Margaret turned to look at her then, with a directness that was different from the pleasant professionalism she'd worn coming in. It was a measuring look, quick, practiced, very slightly surprised. Then the pleasantness returned, smooth and unruffled. "Observant," Margaret said. "Occupational hazard," Nora said, and left it at that. They worked through the morning with a rhythm that surprised Nora. Margaret was not inefficient, whatever else she was. She was methodical, thorough, and entirely unwilling to be told how to do something twice. When Nora showed her where the cleaning supplies for the second floor were kept, she needed to see it once. When the schedule changed because the florist arrived early to drop off arrangements for Sunday, Margaret redirected herself without being asked, moving the vases to where Nora pointed and wiping the water rings from the hall table with a speed and neatness that suggested she was working very hard to look like she'd done this before. She hadn't, quite, but she was trying. That, Nora thought, was interesting in its own right. People who hired other people to clean their homes generally didn't know what that work looked like up close. They had an idea, something vague involving effort and result. The mess disappearing by some domestic alchemy they had never needed to examine. Margaret clearly had that idea and was clearly working to fill it in with practice, which meant she cared enough about the performance to do it carefully, which meant she had a reason. Nora was not an impulsive person. She had built her career on the principle that action taken without information was almost always more expensive than the pause. So she paused. She filed what she had observed into the part of her mind that was always quietly running, the part that processed data while the rest of her spoke and smiled and got things done. And she said nothing, and she made lunch. She made it for both of them without being asked because the clock read 1, and Margaret had not stopped. And Nora had grown up in a household where you fed people who were working. 2 bowls of tomato soup from the pot she'd put on that morning, toast on the side, the good olive oil drizzled over the top the way her mother used to do it. Margaret sat at the kitchen island and looked at the bowl in front of her, and something moved across her face. Something brief and complicated that she put away before Nora could name it. "You cooked," Margaret said. "It was already on," Nora said, sitting across from her. Seemed wasteful not to share. They ate in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. Outside, a car passed on the long gravel drive. A delivery, redirected to the service entrance by the security system, the way Elliot had set it up when he bought the house 4 years ago. The sound faded. "You've lived here long?" Margaret asked. "I moved in 3 months ago," Nora said. "We're getting married in the spring." "Congratulations," Margaret said, and the word was careful. Not cold. Careful, which was different. "Thank you," Nora said. She tore a corner from her toast and thought, not for the first time, about what Elliot had told her of his mother. "She's private. She's particular. She loves me the way a hawk loves the sky, completely, and with a great deal of surveillance." He had said it with affection, which was how she knew it was also true. He had said his mother would come around, and then had been slightly vague about when that process had begun, or how far along it currently was. Nora dipped her toast and said nothing. Margaret finished her soup before Nora did, which was the first genuinely natural thing she had done all morning, eating at whatever speed her body chose, without performing it. She set the spoon down and looked at the empty bowl, and then looked at Nora. "This is a very large house for one person to manage," she said. "There's usually a full staff," Nora said. "This week was unusual." "But you're here," Margaret said. "On your knees in the foyer. Someone had to be. You could have called the agency." "I did," Nora said and smiled slightly. "They sent you." A pause. Something moved again in Margaret's face. This time it was almost amusement, quickly set aside, but not quite quickly enough. "They did," she said. After lunch, they worked through the afternoon. Nora took the second floor and Margaret stayed on the first, and Nora moved through the guest rooms and the linen closets and the bathroom with the clawfoot tub, and she was making tight hospital corners on the guest bed closest to the window when she heard it. A quiet sound from the hallway, something between a breath and a word, quickly suppressed. She came to the doorway and looked. Margaret was standing in front of the framed photographs on the hall wall. The gallery Elliot had put up of family pictures, stretching back decades. She was standing very still, looking at one near the top, and her hand had come up without her noticing, fingertips resting lightly against the frame. The photograph was 30 years old at least, a young woman in a white blouse laughing at something off camera, squinting into summer light. A small boy beside her, maybe 3, grabbing her hand with both of his. Nora looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Margaret. Then she went quietly back to the bed and continued folding the corners. By 4 o'clock, the house was clean, genuinely, thoroughly clean. The kind that takes 2 people working steadily all day and means something. The marble floors caught the late light and gave it back. The arrangements the florist had left stood in the hallways, smelling of eucalyptus and white roses. The kitchen gleamed. Nora walked Margaret to the door. "Same time tomorrow?" Nora asked. Margaret looked at her, that measuring look again, with something in it now that hadn't been there this morning. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of the question that precedes warmth. "Yes," she said, "same time." She put on her coat, cashmere, charcoal gray, the kind that doesn't pill, and she walked out to the drive, and Nora stood in the doorway and watched her get into a car she hadn't noticed before. A black sedan idling at the far end of the gravel, a driver stepping out to open the door. Nora stood there a moment after the car disappeared. Then she stepped inside, closed the door, leaned against it, and let herself feel the full weight of the day. She had known since 11 in the morning. The shoes had told her. The grip had told her. The way she'd looked at the photograph had told her in a language that needed no translation. Elliot's mother was 64, silver-haired, and had once laughed in a white blouse in the summer, squinting into the light with her whole face. Nora had seen the family photos. She had done her homework, the way any careful person does. She knew what Margaret Weston looked like. She picked up her phone and did not call Elliot and went to make tea. Nora found it wedged between the cushions of the sitting room sofa, a slim leather wallet, cognac-colored, with 2 folded bills visible at the edge. She didn't open it. She set it on the side table where it would be visible to anyone entering the room, and she went back to what she was doing, which was arranging the books on the low shelf by the window in the order Elliot preferred. Not alphabetical, not by color the way designers always suggested, but by the year he'd first read them. A system that looked like chaos and was entirely personal, and which she had learned because she had asked. Margaret arrived at 8, same as the day before, in the same cardigan and trousers combination, different shoes, flats today, still good leather, barely broken in. She moved through the foyer with the ease of someone who had been here before, which she had, except in a different capacity, in a different life. "The sitting room needs dusting," Nora said, coming out of the hallway. "I started on the kitchen already." "Of course," Margaret said. She took her coat to the supply closet and came out with the duster and walked into the sitting room, and Nora listened from the kitchen with one ear pointed toward the door. It took about 40 seconds. "Miss Callahan," Margaret called, "there's a wallet on the table here. Did you leave it?" Nora came to the doorway. "Not mine," she said. "Probably fell out of someone's coat. Could you leave it on the hall table? I'll have Elliot check if it belongs to one of the guys from his Thursday night thing." "There's cash in it," Margaret said. "I see that," Nora said. "Hall table's fine. She went back to the kitchen. She heard Margaret set the wallet on the hall table. She heard the quiet, considered pause before footsteps resumed. That was test number one. Test number two came after lunch on the second day, in the form of a phone call Margaret took in the downstairs hallway, audible to anyone in the adjacent sitting room, which Nora currently occupied with a vacuum cleaner that she had just that moment switched off. "I understand you're frustrated, Raymond," Margaret said into the phone, her voice carrying the particular even tone of someone choosing words with precision. "But I'm not available to arbitrate that right now." A pause. "Because I'm working." Another pause. "That's not your concern." Nora started the vacuum again. Test number three was the fall. It happened at 3:15 on the second afternoon, in the kitchen, which Nora had left to get fresh cleaning cloths from the supply closet upstairs. She was back in under 2 minutes, and she found Margaret on the floor near the kitchen island. Not crumpled, not distressed, but down, one hand on the tile, the other reaching for the island's edge with the careful movements of someone who has calculated how this should look. Nora crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, crouched beside her, put a hand under her elbow. "Easy," she said. "Don't rush it. What happened? Did your knee give out?" "I slipped," Margaret said. "The tile. Stupid." "It's not stupid. These floors are unforgiving. Can you put weight on it?" Nora was already checking. No shoes askew, no fabric torn, hands intact. The fall, if it had happened, had been remarkably neat. "I think so," Margaret said. Nora helped her up, guided her to the kitchen stool, and then went to the freezer without asking, and came back with a dish towel around ice, which she held out with a look that said, "Don't argue." Margaret took it. She pressed it to her wrist. She looked at Nora with an expression that had dropped for just a fraction of a moment, its professional pleasantness. And underneath was something more genuine and more difficult, a flicker of something that might have been shame and might have been surprise. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Of course," Nora said. She sat on the stool beside her. "Take 5 minutes." They sat in silence. The ice pack crinkled softly. Outside, the November light had gone flat and white, the kind that precedes snow that will not come. All threat and no follow-through, like a bluff held too long. "You've been very kind this week," Margaret said to the middle distance. "You've been very helpful," Nora said. "The pantry looks better than it ever has." "You're not curious," Margaret said. She was still looking away, but her voice had shifted slightly. Not a test now, or not only a test. Something that wanted to be something else. About who I am, where I came from. Nora considered this. She considered it as a genuine question and also as something shaped like one, and she answered both. "People are more than their origins," she said, "and I learned a long time ago that the most interesting things about a person usually take more than 2 days to show up." Margaret turned and looked at her directly, and this time she did not look away. "How long have you worked in hospitality?" she asked. The question was specific. Too specific for a stranger to land on, unless they'd been paying close attention to the way Nora moved through the house. The check-in style scan of a room she did entering any space. The instinct to notice what needed addressing before being asked. The professional ease with which she handled the florist's early arrival and the security system alert and the delivery that went to the wrong gate. 11 years, Nora said. "I managed a hotel on the Upper East Side before this." "Before this," Margaret repeated. "Before Elliot. Before the engagement." Nora looked at her hands. "Before I decided to figure out what I wanted my life to look like when I wasn't running someone else's operations." Silence then. "And what does it look like?" Nora looked around the kitchen. The high ceilings, the November garden visible through the glass, the ice pack, the two of them perched on stools in the middle of the afternoon, like two people who had each, for their own separate reasons, ended up somewhere unexpected. "A lot like this, actually," she said, "minus some of the ambiguity." Something crossed Margaret's face that Nora did not try to name, because naming it would have felt like taking something that wasn't hers. She just let it be there. She said nothing about what she had seen in the pantry an hour earlier. A small notebook, tucked between Margaret's coat and the wall of the supply closet, in which she'd glimpsed. She hadn't meant to look, but she had. Two columns that appeared to be a list. Nora's name at the top. Items below, each with a check or a blank space. She had looked away immediately. She had not counted the items or read the words. She did not need to. That evening, after Margaret's car had come and gone, Nora sat in the study with her laptop and her cup of tea and a half-drafted email to a man named Stuart Gould, who ran a hospitality consulting group out of Midtown and had been for the past 3 months trying to get her to come on as a partner. The work was interesting. The money was substantial. The central problem was a London component, an 18-month engagement with a hotel group based in Knightsbridge that would have her in England for more than a year before the wedding. She had drafted the polite decline 4 times. She had sent none of them. She looked at the draft now, and then looked at the window, and then looked at the draft again. She added a line about timing. She removed a line about timing. She closed the laptop. She was not, she told herself, afraid of the test. She was afraid of what it meant that someone felt the need to administer it, because that fear did not belong to her alone. Someone else was carrying it, a woman in good shoes who held a coffee mug with both hands and looked at old photographs in hallways when she thought no one was watching. Nora's phone lit up. "Elliot." "Hey," he said when she answered. His voice had the particular looseness of a man leaving his office after a long day. The 20-minute depressurization that happened between the elevator and the car. "How's the house? Maria back?" "Not until Monday," Nora said. "The agency sent someone. It's been fine." "You didn't have to do all that yourself?" "I know." "You're too capable," he said with affection. "It's intimidating." "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." He laughed. She heard the car door open, the familiar sound of his world closing around him. "Mom called today," he said more carefully. "About Sunday." "I know about Sunday. She wants it to go well, Nora, in her way." "Her way," Nora said. "She's private about people," he said. "It takes her time, but she does eventually. She opens up. You just have to know that the process it's not always readable from the outside." Nora thought about the notebook, the 2 columns, her name at the top. "I know," she said. "It's okay, Elliot." After they hung up, she sat in the quiet study and thought about what she was not telling him, and why, and whether the reasons were good ones. The house settled around her the way old houses do, a tick in the east wall, a hum from somewhere below. The photographs in the upstairs hallway were dark now. The one of the young woman laughing in summer light was invisible in the dark. But Nora had already memorized it. She'd been doing that her whole life, committing things to memory in case they were the kind of things people tried to take back. On the 3rd morning, Margaret arrived with a small bag from a bakery on Lexington. Croissants, still warm, in a paper bag spotted with grease. She set them on the kitchen counter without announcement, and when Nora came downstairs and found them, Margaret was already at the sink, filling the kettle. "From a place near my apartment," Margaret said without turning around. "They're better than they look." Nora took one. It was, in fact, extraordinary. Flaky in the way that takes 3 days and a great deal of butter to achieve. She ate half of it standing at the counter and didn't say anything. And Margaret made the coffee without being shown where anything was, because by now she had simply learned it. And they stood in the kitchen together eating pastry in the early morning as the light came up gray and silver over the garden. And for a stretch of 20 minutes, neither of them was performing anything. That was the moment Nora thought, she's not entirely wrong to be afraid. Not of Nora, of what Nora represented, the transfer of a life center of gravity, the way love rearranges the whole map of who matters most to whom. Nora had watched her mother reckon with something similar when her brother married his husband and the orbit of the family shifted. It was not malice. It was the physics of attachment, the terror of becoming peripheral to the thing you built. She could not say any of this, but she could eat the croissant, and she did. What she discovered that afternoon, not deliberately, but the way you discover most important things, which is by being in a room at the wrong moment, was the phone call. She had gone to the supply closet for a second roll of paper towels, and the sitting room was adjacent, and the door was open. And Margaret was not speaking loudly, but was not whispering either, because she had thought herself alone. "She's not what I expected," Margaret said. And the voice was different from the one Nora had been hearing for 3 days. It was quieter and more uncertain. The careful exterior set down like a heavy bag at the end of a long trip. Vivian, I need you to come Sunday. I need, I need you to be there. A pause. I know what I said. Just come. Nora took the paper towels. She went back upstairs. She stood in the guest bathroom for a moment with both hands on the cool edge of the porcelain sink, looking at herself in the mirror. Vivian. She knew the name. Elliot had mentioned it exactly once in the early months, in the way people mention things they think are finished and are not. Vivian Hartley, the woman his mother had spent 3 years quietly positioning, the one who came to the family's Greenwich house for Thanksgiving, the one whose family had known the Westons since both their grandfathers sat on the same bank board in 1974, the one who wasn't Nora. Nora looked at herself in the mirror for a moment more. Then she rolled up her sleeves, picked up the cleaning cloth, and got back to work. Vivian Hartley arrived on a Thursday. Nora was upstairs when she heard the sound, the specific acoustic signature of the front door being opened by someone who knew the code, followed by the tap of heels on the foyer marble, and a voice calling out with the warmth of someone calling out in a space they consider familiar. Margaret, I'm early. The driver made good time. Nora set down the folding she'd been doing, listened to the silence that followed, and then heard Margaret's voice from the study, controlled and measured. In here! She did not go down immediately. She sat on the edge of the guest bed for a moment, her hands in her lap, the afternoon light falling in pale rectangles across the floor. The house had a particular quality when she was alone in it. Not lonely, but spacious, the way thoughts get when there's room for them. She had come to appreciate that quality over 3 months of learning to live inside someone else's walls. She stood, straightened the bed, and went downstairs. The woman in the study was perhaps 35, tall and deliberately assembled. Not in the anxious way of someone trying too hard, but in the confident way of someone who has never had reason to doubt that assembling themselves carefully is simply what one does. Blonde, and not carelessly so. A coat that Nora recognized as the kind of investment piece purchased at a store where they offer you champagne before showing you anything with a price tag. She was sitting across from Margaret with her ankles crossed and her hands loosely folded, and she was saying something in a low voice that stopped when Nora appeared in the doorway. Oh, Vivian said, and the single syllable contained a rapid recalibration. Hi, Nora said. I'm Nora. Are you joining us Sunday? A beat. Then Vivian smiled, and the smile was practiced enough to be attractive, and not so practiced that it telegraphed effort. That's the plan, she said. I've heard a lot about you. Good things, I hope, Nora said, which was a thing people said when they had no reliable information about what had been said and were interested in watching the response. Vivian's response was to let the smile hold and say nothing more, which was its own information. Margaret had gone still in the way she had when she was thinking hard about something. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at Nora with the particular expression that Nora had started to think of as the assessment expression. Not hostile, not warm, but intent. The expression of someone taking measurements. I'll finish the upstairs linen, Nora said. The closet on the right needs restocking. I'll add it to the supply list. Thank you, Margaret said. Nora went back upstairs. She did not eavesdrop. She did the linen, and she restocked what could be restocked with what was on hand, and she went to the bathroom and cleaned the mirror with a slow, deliberate circular motion. And she thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the difference between the two might cost her. What she knew, Vivian had been invited by Margaret, not by Elliot, and Margaret had made that call yesterday with an uncertainty in her voice that didn't fit a person executing a confident plan. What she didn't know, whether Margaret had shown Vivian the notebook and what was in the unchecked boxes on the list. 30 minutes later, she was coming down the back stairs when she heard Vivian's voice again, carrying from the study with the comfortable projection of someone unaware of acoustics. The father, Vivian was saying, I had a friend look into the family. He was an alcoholic. He's been sober 8 years, apparently. But still. And they had, I think the technical word is bankruptcy, the restaurant they ran, when she was in high school. A pause. People struggle, Margaret said carefully. Of course, Vivian said. I'm not saying, I'm just saying you should know the full picture. Before Sunday. Another pause, longer this time. Nora had stopped on the third step from the bottom. She was not breathing especially. She's nothing like what I imagined, Margaret said, and the statement didn't close with any adjective, left itself open and unresolved. And Nora understood from the silence that followed that Vivian didn't know what to do with that either. Nora stepped off the stairs and went into the kitchen and began making tea with the focused calm of someone who has decided to feel things later, in a more convenient location. She had known about her father for her entire life, which meant she had had her entire life to decide what it meant to her and what it didn't. She had watched him drink his way through her childhood, and she had helped her mother keep the restaurant running through the lean years, and she had driven him to his first AA meeting, and she had sat in the parking lot for 2 hours while he was inside, listening to a playlist she couldn't remember now, and crying in a way she hadn't done since. And when he walked out looking smaller and more careful than she'd ever seen him, she had put the car in drive and taken him home, and neither of them had talked about it, then or after, because in her family, love was sometimes expressed through the discipline of not making a person explain themselves. She was not ashamed of him. She was not ashamed of the restaurant or the bankruptcy or the years her mother had taken in alterations to keep the lights on. She was not ashamed of any of it, and she had made that decision at 22 in the parking lot of a community center in Hoboken, and she had not revisited it. But standing in Elliot's kitchen, pouring boiling water over a tea bag with steady hands, she felt the old, familiar tightening in the chest. The sense of being assessed from a direction you cannot face, of having something private turned over by hands that don't know what they're holding. She sat down at the island. She drank her tea. She was entirely composed by the time she heard footsteps in the hall. It was Vivian, not Margaret. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with the slightly uncertain energy of someone who has not decided yet whether to attempt friendliness or skip it. Margaret's taking a call, she said. Mind if I... She gestured toward the kitchen in general. Water's still hot, Nora said. Vivian made herself a cup of something, herbal from the smell, and leaned against the counter across from Nora in a way that was attempting casualness with about 80% success. She looked around the kitchen with the particular quality of looking that is actually assessing. The appliances, the arrangement of things, the ease with which Nora occupied the space. How long have you and Elliot been together? She asked. 2 years, Nora said. Engaged for 6 months. He seems happy, Vivian said. It came out sincere, which was the most disarming thing she'd said so far. I think he is, Nora said. Silence. Vivian looked at her tea. She seemed to be working something out. Margaret is... She's not easy, she said finally. She loves fiercely, and she protects fiercely, and those two things look the same from the outside, but they're not. I've known her for a long time, and it took me years to understand the difference. Nora looked at her. This was not what she'd expected. I'm not trying to... Vivian stopped. Started again. I came because she asked me to, and I said yes because I always say yes to her. But I don't think Sunday is going to go the way she's planned, and I thought you should know she's not cruel. She's just scared. Scared of what? Nora said. Vivian looked at her directly. Of the same thing everyone who loves someone is scared of, she said. Of not being enough anymore. She finished her tea and rinsed the cup and set it on the rack with a quiet precision, and she went back to the study, and Nora sat with the information for a long moment before she decided she didn't know what to do with it. That evening, Elliot came home earlier than expected. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of his key in the back door, the specific weight of his footfall on the kitchen tile, the way he always paused just inside the threshold to decompress from the outside world before he became, again, only himself. You're early, she said from the sitting room. Canceled the last call, he said, appearing in the doorway still in his coat. He looked at her. The way he looked at her when he was checking, when something in him needed the reassurance of her being real and present and exactly herself. Hey, she said. He came in and sat beside her on the sofa with his coat still on, which meant he wasn't staying still for long, and he didn't kiss her immediately, but looked at her with those dark eyes that saw more than he always let on. And he said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said, and heard it as the lie it was the moment it left her mouth. He heard it too. She saw him register it, the slight change in the set of his shoulders, the attention sharpening. "Nora, I'm tired," she said. "It's been a long week." He looked at her for a moment more, and she held his gaze, which was harder than usual, because he was not a person who looked away first, and neither was she. Then he nodded slowly and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that in the sitting room with the lights low and the November garden dark outside the window. And she felt the lie sitting between them like a third person, small and quiet and making itself comfortable. She told herself it was not, technically, a lie. She was tired. The week had been long. These were facts. What she hadn't said was also facts. She was choosing between them. Upstairs, the hallway photographs were dark again. The laughing woman in the summer light, invisible. "My mother called," Elliot said into the quiet. "About Sunday. She sounded, I don't know, different." "Different how?" "Uncertain," he said. "She doesn't usually sound uncertain." Nora said nothing. "Whatever she's doing," Elliot said carefully, "I want you to know that I see you. Whatever she thinks she's—" He stopped. "I love you, Nora. That's not something anyone gets to audit." She turned and looked at him. He meant it. He meant it the way people mean things when the meaning is so complete, they don't need to ornament it. "I know," she said. And she did know it. What she didn't know was whether knowing it would be enough for what was coming. She said goodnight to him and went to bed before he did, which she never did. And she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the things she was holding that were not hers to hold. Not entirely. She was holding the secret of what she knew, which protected Margaret's dignity at the cost of her own transparency. She was holding the information about London, the draft email that had become a kind of daily small dishonesty she performed in her own direction, telling herself she'd decide later, while later quietly became never. She was holding Vivian's strange, reluctant kindness, which she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. And she was holding the image of a woman at 3 in the afternoon, sitting at a kitchen island with ice on her wrist, looking at Nora with something real underneath all the careful performance, something that wanted to trust and didn't know how to do it without giving up the advantage. Sunday was 2 days away. Nora closed her eyes. She thought about the restaurant in Hoboken, the smell of it when the ventilation wasn't working, and the summer heat came through the back door, the sound of her mother's voice calling orders, and the sound of her father's laughter when things were good. The way she'd learned to read a room by reading that room, reading the tables, reading the night, reading the fine line between a good evening and a disaster, the way you learned to lean into problems early so they didn't become the kind of problem you couldn't solve. She would lean in. That had always been her way. But the timing of it and the cost of it and who would be standing at the end, those were the things she did not yet know. The dinner table was set with the good china. Nora noticed it the moment she came downstairs at 6:15. The Weston family china, cream-colored with a thin gold border, which Elliot had told her lived in a cabinet in the dining room and was reserved for occasions that warranted it. She had been in this house for 3 months and had never seen it on the table. She stood in the hallway and looked at the table through the open dining room doors and understood immediately that the table was not a coincidence. Margaret had arrived at 3 to supervise the caterer, an arrangement Elliot had explained to Nora with the slightly apologetic brevity of a man who has long since learned that some things are more efficiently accepted than negotiated. "She likes to be involved," he'd said. "Let her be involved." Nora had agreed to this. She had agreed to a great many things in the past week with a calm that she recognized in herself as the product of discipline rather than ease. Vivian was already there when Nora came downstairs, already seated, one hand on a wine glass she hadn't yet lifted, wearing a deep green dress that was perfect for exactly this kind of occasion and did not look like an accident. She looked up when Nora entered, and her expression was complicated. Not triumphant, not warm, but the expression of someone who has set a thing in motion and is no longer entirely sure they want to see where it lands. "You look lovely," Vivian said. "Thank you," Nora said. Margaret came from the kitchen carrying nothing, which meant she had come to see. She was in a different register tonight. Her own clothes, her own presentation, the cardigan and trousers replaced by a charcoal dress, and the particular bearing of a woman who has put back on the armor she'd laid aside all week. She looked at Nora entering the room and her face was neutral with effort. "Nora," she said, "Elliot is... he'll be down in a moment." "I know," Nora said. "He was on a call. He'll be 3 minutes." She said it pleasantly and she sat across from Vivian and she folded her hands on the table and she waited. Elliot came down in 4 minutes, still tying his cufflink, and the sight of the china stopped him in the doorway, the same way it had stopped Nora. And for a fraction of a second she saw in his face the look of a man who understands more than he is saying. He came in and kissed her temple and pressed his hand briefly to her shoulder, a private signal, small as a comma, and sat at the head of the table, and the dinner began. The caterer had done something with duck and something with a root vegetable that involved a reduction, and there was wine that Nora's own knowledge told her cost more per bottle than her first week's salary at the front desk of the hotel where she'd started at 22. It was a beautiful meal. Everything was beautiful. The candles, the china, the November darkness outside the tall windows, the way the light fell on 4 people who were all, in their separate ways, performing. Margaret guided the conversation with the skill of a woman who had hosted 500 dinners and knew exactly what she was doing. She moved from topic to topic with a light touch. The architectural project Elliot had just closed, a gallery opening Vivian had attended, the neighborhood in Boston where Nora had grown up, and then with the practiced timing of someone who had planned this precisely, she moved toward Vivian. "Vivian was telling me," Margaret said, setting her fork down with a small, decisive click, "about a piece she read, about the challenges of..." "What was it, Vivian?" "People from different professional backgrounds building a shared life. The adjustments involved." Vivian picked up the thread with a smoothness that only confirmed she'd been expecting the cue. "It was about the social research on it, actually," she said, her voice pleasant and calibrated. "The way certain formative experiences shape a person's long-term patterns. Financially, emotionally." She looked at Nora with an expression of polite neutrality that had something surgical underneath it. "Your family ran a restaurant, didn't they, Nora? In New Jersey?" The table went quiet in the way dinner tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone understands and no one acknowledges. Elliot's hand moved to his wine glass, but he didn't drink. Nora sat with the question for one full breath, and in that breath she made the decision she had been standing at the edge of since Thursday morning, when she heard a word in a hallway and chose not to walk the other way. She looked at Vivian, she looked at the table, and then she looked at Margaret, and she said in a voice that was entirely calm, "Mrs. Weston." The room went perfectly, completely still. Margaret's face did not change immediately. It changed the way stone changes underwater, slowly in increments, as something long-held softens. "The shoes gave you away first," Nora said pleasantly, as if they were discussing the wine. "Louboutins cream with the red sole. You wore them the first morning. They looked like shoes you'd had for years. You wore them the way you wear comfort." She picked up her own glass. The grip was second. "You shook my hand like someone accustomed to board meetings, not like someone who'd spent a career in domestic work. And your hands, they were smooth in the wrong places. Cleaning products don't do that." She set the glass down. "The photograph was third. The hall wall, second floor. You touched the frame and you didn't realize you'd done it. There's only one person who would touch that particular photograph that way." She paused. "And I know what you look like, Mrs. Weston. I did my research when Elliot and I got engaged. That's what people do when they care about the family they're marrying into." The silence stretched. Elliot was looking at his mother. His face was doing something difficult and controlled. "You knew," Margaret said finally. The words came out without their usual precision, just words stripped of their handling. "The whole week. Since 11 o'clock the first morning," Nora said. "And you said nothing." "Neither did you." Margaret looked at her. Vivian was very still, her green dress like a flag in a wind that had stopped blowing. "Why?" Margaret said. The question was smaller than her other words. It had more weight in it. "If you knew, why did you play along?" Nora looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the ice pack, the croissants from Lexington, the coffee made exactly the right way, the stillness in front of the photograph, the phone call she'd overheard on the third step from the bottom of the back stairs. "Because you needed to see something you could only see if I let you look," she said. "And because I understood, from the first morning, what you were actually afraid of. And I thought you deserved the answer to that question, even if you were going about getting it the wrong way." Elliot pushed his chair back. The sound of it on the floor was contained and sharp. "Mom," he said, and the single word was a complete sentence. Not a question, not an accusation, just the sound of a man looking at the distance between where he thought things were and where they actually were. "Elliot." "Not here," he said. He looked at Nora, and in his eyes she saw something that undid her slightly. Not anger at her, but anger that had no clean direction, the hardest kind. "Not like this." He stood. He went to the hallway. They heard a moment later the sound of the coat closet and then the front door, closing with the careful restraint of someone who is working very hard not to slam it. Nora sat with that sound. Vivian stood quietly. "I'll go," she said to no one in particular, and she collected her coat from the back of her chair with a stillness that suggested she was recalibrating something fundamental. At the doorway, she stopped and she looked at Nora and she said, "For what it's worth." Then she stopped because whatever came after that sentence, she had not found the words for yet. She left. And then it was just Nora and Margaret. The candles were still burning. The food was still on the plates. The good china caught the candlelight and gave it back in small, curved pieces. Margaret was looking at the table. She had the expression of a woman who has played a chess game for days and arrived at check only to discover the board was configured differently than she had been seeing it. "You're angry," she said to the table. "I'm not," Nora said, which was mostly true. The thing she felt was not the hot, indignant thing called anger. It was something older and sadder and more willing to sit with complexity. "I'm worried about him, and I'm worried about you. Both of those worry me for different reasons and in the same direction." Margaret finally looked up. "I hurt him," she said, not a question. "You surprised him," Nora said. "Elliot doesn't do well with surprises that touch things he trusts. He trusts you. He trusts me. You've made those two things complicated for him tonight, and he needs time." "And you," Margaret said. "I hurt you." Nora considered this with her honest attention. "You brought Vivian into my home to, I think, remind everyone of what I'm not," she said. "That part stings. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Silence. "But I also understand why," Nora said. "And understanding a thing doesn't mean excusing it. It just means I'm not going to waste time being surprised by it." Margaret looked at her with an expression Nora had never seen on her face in the entire week. Uncurated, unrehearsed. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere without a plan. "I don't know what I expected you to be," she said. "I made a list. I made it very specific. I had criteria." She stopped. "None of them covered this." "None of them covered what?" Nora said. Margaret was quiet for a long time. "Someone who would let me look," she said finally. "Someone who would let me see what I was doing and not stop me, and still be here at the end of it." The candles burned. The November night pressed against the tall windows. "I haven't decided to be here yet," Nora said quietly. "That depends on some things." And that was where they left it. Nora still sitting at the table, the china gleaming in the candlelight, the question hanging open in the air between them like a door neither of them had yet found the courage to walk through. Midnight. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet when something has broken and not yet been repaired. A specific quality of silence, like a held breath. Nora had cleared the table herself, slowly, carrying the china back to the cabinet piece by piece, the way you carry things you know are irreplaceable. She had blown out the candles. She had turned off the dining room light. She had done these things because there was nothing else to do at the moment, and doing nothing was not something she knew how to survive. She found Margaret in the study, not sitting at the desk, not reading, just sitting in the deep chair near the window in the dark, the November garden a barely visible outline beyond the glass. She did not turn when Nora appeared in the doorway. She did not pretend not to know she was there. "It's late," Margaret said. "I know," Nora said. She came in. She sat in the other chair, the one across the low table from Margaret's, and she did not turn on the lamp because the dark felt appropriate for what she had decided she needed to ask. "What were you so afraid of?" she said. Margaret did not deflect. She sat with the question, which Nora had half expected her not to do, and the quality of that sitting, patient, honest, willing, was the first thing Margaret had given her that had no performance in it at all. "He was 4 when his father died," Margaret said eventually. 4 years old and I was 31, and I had a company that was 3 years old and not yet profitable, and a child who asked me every morning if Daddy was coming home today." She paused. "You learn to be everything when you have to be, not because you want to, but because the other option is not being enough, and you cannot afford that. You cannot afford to be not enough." She turned and looked at Nora. "I was everything for 30 years. I was good at it. I was genuinely good at it." "You were," Nora said. "And then he brought you home," she said. "And you were capable. You were so extraordinarily, immediately capable. You walked into a room and you handled it, and I watched him watch you, and he didn't need me to be everything anymore, because you were there." She stopped. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like love," Nora said. "A frightened love. But love." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "I made a list," she said. "I had it in a notebook. Criteria. I was going to find something disqualifying. That's the truth of it. I needed there to be something disqualifying." "I know," Nora said. "I didn't find it," Margaret said. "And I couldn't stop the process once I'd started it, because stopping it would have required me to look at what I was actually doing, and I wasn't ready to do that." She turned back to the window. "And then I called Vivian, that was a cruelty, and I knew it was a cruelty, and I did it anyway." Nora was quiet. "Vivian told me, on her way out, that she'd warned you," Margaret said. "She said she told you I was scared, not cruel. She said she hoped it helped." A pause. "It was a kind thing for her to do. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty." "She loves you," Nora said. "People do strange and occasionally unhelpful things when they love someone." Something moved in Margaret's face. Not tears, but the internal upheaval that sometimes precedes them. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for all of it. The notebook, the tests, the wallet, the fall I didn't actually have." "I know you didn't actually fall," Nora said. "And Vivian, and your father, and everything I thought would—" She stopped. "I went about this in the most—" "Margaret," Nora said, and using the name on purpose, without the title, felt deliberate in a way she intended. "I need you to hear something." She waited until she was sure she had the woman's full attention. "I am not going to compete with your 30 years, Nora said. "I am not trying to replace what you are to him. I'm not interested in becoming his everything. I've run operations that required me to be everything to everyone, and I know what that costs, and I wouldn't wish it on a person I loved." She leaned forward slightly. "What I want is to be his partner. His specific, particular partner who argues with him about the thermostat and knows he reads his books in the wrong order, and sat with him at 2 in the morning last winter when something went wrong with the Chicago property, and it was going to cost more than either of them had counted on. That's what I want. That is not the same thing as what you were." Margaret was looking at her with an expression Nora didn't try to name. "There is room," Nora said, "for both of us, in his life. But only if you decide there is." The silence was very long. Outside, a car passed on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the garden wall. "I don't know how to do that," Margaret said quietly. "I know," Nora said, "but I think you're more teachable than you've been pretending." The sound that came from Margaret was so unexpected that it took Nora a moment to identify it. A laugh. Short, involuntary, genuine. the kind that escapes before the person has approved it. Then Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, and the laugh turned into something else, and Nora sat across from her and did not look away, because this was not a moment for politeness. She sat there for a long time. She sat there until Margaret found her way through to the other side of whatever it was, and composed herself, and sat in the quiet again with a different quality. Lighter, more tired, but the kind of tired that comes from setting something down rather than from carrying it. "You should go find him," Margaret said finally. "I will," Nora said. She stood. "But first, are we okay? You and I?" Margaret looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "But I think we could be." Nora nodded. "That's enough," she said. "That's actually enough for tonight." She got her coat from the hall closet and she called a car, and while she waited, she sat on the stairs in the front hall in the dark, and she thought about what she was going to say, and then she decided she wasn't going to plan it, because the things that mattered most in her life had never benefited from being planned, only from being felt all the way through without flinching. The car came. She got in. Elliot's apartment was on the west side, the place he'd kept after buying the mansion, ostensibly for late nights in the city, but really she had always suspected as a kind of psychological emergency exit, a place that was unambiguously his and no one else's. She had been there 6 or 7 times. She knew the doorman's name was Gerald, and that he preferred the night shift because his wife worked mornings and they split the childcare. Gerald let her up without calling ahead. She took the elevator. She stood in front of the door. She knocked. A long pause. Then footsteps, not coming to the door immediately, the footsteps of someone deciding. The door opened. He looked tired in the way that is not about sleep, the particular exhaustion of a person who has had to reconfigure something they thought was solid. He was in the clothes he'd worn to dinner, but the tie was gone and his sleeves were rolled up, and he looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things that mattered to him, very directly, without preamble. "Hey," she said. He held the door and looked at her, and then looked past her at the empty hallway, and then back at her. "You knew," he said, "the whole week." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." "No." He stepped back from the door, not to let her in, not quite, but the beginning of it. She didn't move. "Why?" he said. "Because it wasn't mine to tell," she said. "It was hers. The choice of what she was doing, and when to stop, and what it meant. And I thought if I told you, you would have ended it immediately, and she would have had her answer handed to her, and she never would have. She wouldn't have had to look at it herself, at what she was doing and why." She paused. "I thought you'd understand that, when I could explain it." "I do understand it," he said, and his voice had an edge she rarely heard from him. "That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. Finding out there was a whole week where you both knew something I didn't. Elliot. And you sat with me every night and said nothing. And I asked you what was wrong and you said, 'Elliot,'" she said more firmly, "I know. I made a choice and it cost you something, and I'm sorry for the cost of it. I'm not sorry for the choice, but I'm sorry it hurt you." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to tell you it was perfect. I'm telling you it was what I thought was right in an impossible situation, and I would have told you everything on Sunday after it was finished." He stood in the doorway. He was working something out. She could see it, the interior process, the way he looked when he was taking something apart in his mind and examining the pieces. "She had a list," he said, "criteria to disqualify you." "I know," Nora said, "and you let her look for something." "Yes, because you knew she wouldn't find it." She thought about this. "Because I knew that whether or not she found it, she needed to look," she said. "People need to come to the things they're afraid of themselves. You can't drag them there." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "My mother has never let anyone in her house she didn't choose. She's never made anyone coffee and eaten lunch with them and—" He stopped. "She doesn't do that. She doesn't do that with people." "She did this week," Nora said. He looked at the floor. Then he looked up. "I was so angry," he said. "I know. At her and at you, and I didn't know what to do with it because I couldn't." He ran his hand over his face. I can't be angry at you for being kind to her, and I can't be angry at her for being scared, and I couldn't figure out where to put it, so I put it in your car and drove here, she said. Something like that, he said. She took a single step forward, still in the hallway, still in her coat. She said, I love you. I am not going anywhere. And I need you to know I actually like her. Your terrifying, infuriating, croissant-bringing, fake-falling mother. I think she's extraordinary. I think she built something remarkable, and she's frightened of losing it, and I would very much like to spend the next 50 years convincing her that there's room. He looked at her. She's hard to convince, he said. I know, Nora said. Lucky for you, I have experience with difficult properties. He laughed then, a real laugh, short and startled, the laugh of a person who did not expect to laugh tonight. And then he stepped back from the door, fully this time, and she came inside, and he closed the door behind her. They stood in the small entryway of his apartment that smelled like him, coffee and dry-cleaned wool and something particular and unnameable that she had come to think of simply as him. And he looked at her the way he had from the first, the kind of looking that requires nothing back except presence. She's never going to admit she was wrong, he said, not in so many words. She already did, Nora said. In the study, in the dark. I don't need the announcement. He took her hand. He held it the way he held things he did not intend to set down. 2 days later, Margaret came to the house. Not as a housekeeper, not as a woman executing a plan, but simply and without ceremony, arriving at 11 in the morning with a box from the bakery on Lexington. The same one, the same croissants, still warm. Nora opened the door. Margaret stood on the step with the box in her camel coat and her excellent shoes, and she looked at Nora, and neither of them spoke for a moment. I was hoping, Margaret said, that I might come in. The coffee's already on, Nora said. She stepped back. Come in. They sat in the kitchen, the same 2 stools at the island, the winter light coming in gray and clean through the garden windows. The croissants were extraordinary again. The coffee was black for both of them, no one needing to ask. At some point, Margaret set her cup down and looked around the kitchen. The same room she had stood in for 3 days, first as a performance, and then as something more complicated, and then as something she hadn't had a name for yet. I'd like to try, she said carefully. If you're willing. Nora looked at her. At what? At... She gestured slightly at the space between them. This. Getting it right. I've been getting it wrong for longer than I'd like to admit, and I'm not young enough to waste more time on getting it wrong. Nora took her time with the answer. She did not rush it because it mattered, and things that mattered deserved their full weight. Yes, she said. I'm willing. They finished the croissants. They talked. Not about Elliot, not about the dinner, not about any of it directly, but about the bakery on Lexington and the green market that ran on the block behind it on Saturdays, and a film Margaret had seen the week before that she had opinions about, and Nora had seen years ago and had different opinions about. And the disagreement was genuine and animated, and for 20 minutes felt like the beginning of something. Elliot came home at noon and found them at the kitchen island, a crumpled pastry bag between them. Mid-argument about whether a particular director's late period was stronger than his early work, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at them, and his face did something private and complicated that he did not attempt to explain. He got himself a cup of coffee. He pulled up a stool. He did not say anything about the week that had passed, or the dinner, or any of it. Not because he was avoiding it, but because some things do not need their ceremony. They only need their resolution. And these 2 women sitting in his kitchen arguing about cinema with the remains of the best croissants in Manhattan between them. This was a resolution. It wasn't tidy. It wasn't finished. Margaret would overstep again, and Nora would sometimes swallow things she should have said, and Elliot would occasionally find himself in the difficult middle position of a person loved by 2 people who express love in complicated ways. These were the textures of a life being built, not the problems that prevent it. But that morning, in the November kitchen, something settled. The particular settling that happens not when everything is resolved, But when the people involved decide that the work of resolution is worth doing, the croissants were extraordinary. The coffee was good. Outside, the November garden waited, patient for whatever came next. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. The kind that shows up wearing old jeans and rubber gloves, that says nothing when it could say everything, that makes lunch for the person who came to find a reason to dismiss it. It's the courage of someone who knows exactly who they are and doesn't need the audience to confirm it. And sometimes the person who comes to test you is the one who needed most to be tested themselves. Not for their cruelty, which was just fear in a good coat, but for their capacity to look honestly at what the fear had made them do. That test doesn't come with a list or a notebook. It comes in the dark, in a study, when someone sits across from you and asks you the one question you've been running from. Kindness offered without conditions is the most difficult and the most durable thing one person can give another. It doesn't ask to be recognized. It doesn't require the other person to be worthy of it before it begins. It simply begins and then keeps going through the tests and the fear and the old photographs on hallway walls, all the way to the kitchen on a Saturday morning, where the coffee is already on and the door was always open.